Welcome back to Loop Podcast of Philippe, everyone. Today we're diving into something that I'm sure many of you are thinking about and something that I've definitely been wondering about as I get a little bit older.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that is finding a job later in life.
Oh, okay.
Especially in a field like tech that changes so rapidly. It can feel like there's this invisible barrier once you hit a certain age.
Yeah, I can see that.
Like you're suddenly overqualified or out of touch, even though retirement's getting pushed back further and
Yeah,
further.
that's a good point. Yeah.
So today, we're going to compare and contrast the situation in two countries, France and Canada.
Okay.
And we have this really interesting story of Philippe. He's a 56-year-old IT professional in France who's struggling to find a job. And he's wondering why it seems so much easier in Canada.
That's a great question.
To get us started, Philippe says, I just don't get why it's so complicated to find a job in IT here compared to Canada. Why are mentalities so different, especially when everyone's saying we'll have to work longer? There's this paradox that I can't explain. Politicians seem really out of touch.
It's definitely a frustrating situation and a valid point he's making.
Yeah. So what's your take on this? Why might Philippe be hitting a wall in France?
Well, France does have a lot of initiatives focused on seniors, but they often emphasize overall well-being rather than employment specifically.
I see.
There's this whole concept of bien vieillir, which translates to aging well.
I've heard of that.
And it's really about having a fulfilling retirement, enjoying your time. So it's almost like the focus shifts away from working.
So it's not that France isn't paying attention to its aging population. It's just that maybe the focus isn't quite where it needs to be for someone like Philippe who wants to keep working.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so that's the overall societal context. But what about specific programs aimed at helping seniors find jobs?
Right. Well, France does have those too, but some of them might not be as effective as they could be.
Oh, okay.
For example, there's the Aide à l'embauche en contrat de professionnalisation. It basically helps people get new skills through on-the-job training.
Okay.
But it often targets younger people, so someone like Philippe might not benefit as much.
I see. It's kind of missing the mark for someone with his experience.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the CDD pour les plus de 57 ans, which is specifically for people over 57.
I remember reading about that. It's a special kind of contract, right?
Yeah, it's a fixed-term contract. So it creates opportunities, but it might not lead to the kind of stable, long-term job that many seniors are looking for.
It's more of a temporary solution.
Right. And then there's the CDI inclusion, which encourages companies to hire people who face barriers to employment.
So that could include seniors.
Yeah, it could, but it's more general, so it's not clear how much it actually helps experienced professionals in fields like IT.
So it seems like even with these programs, there's still a gap between what's available and what someone like Philippe actually needs.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Now, let's switch gears a bit and think about Philippe's situation if he were in Canada instead.
Okay.
What would he be facing there?
Well, Canada seems to have a very different approach.
How so?
Well, for one, they have financial incentives to encourage businesses to hire and keep older workers.
Oh, interesting.
They seem to really recognize the value and experience that seniors bring to the table.
That's great. So they're actually putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly.
That's a pretty big difference right there.
Yeah, for sure.
And I understand they even have a project called Seduction 69 Ands.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. It's specifically designed to encourage businesses to recruit and retain workers in that age group.
Wow, that's very targeted.
Yeah, it is. And it seems to be part of a broader trend in Canada.
What do you mean?
Well, Canada has been dealing with labor shortages in a lot of sectors.
Right, I've heard that.
So they're looking to seniors as a valuable resource to fill those gaps and keep the economy going strong.
So it's a more proactive approach.
Yeah. They're not just reacting to an aging population. They're actively trying to engage seniors in the workforce.
Okay, so it seems like Canada is really trying to change the narrative around senior employment.
Yeah, it's less about aging well and more about staying active and contributing.
That's a good way to put it. They're focusing on the positive aspects of what seniors can bring to the table.
Exactly. And that can make a big difference in how older workers are perceived and valued.
And ultimately, in their chances of finding fulfilling work.
Absolutely.
This is fascinating stuff. We've already uncovered some pretty stark contrasts between France and Canada, just in terms of their overall approach to senior employment.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to explore, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break.
One thing we haven't really talked about yet is this whole idea of flexibility in the
Oh,
workplace
that's a good point.
and how that might play into these different approaches we're seeing.
Yeah, you're right. We haven't touched on that.
So flexibility can be a game changer for older workers.
I can imagine.
They might have different needs and priorities compared to younger employees.
Like what kind of things?
Well, things like childcare responsibilities, or maybe they're caring for elderly parents themselves.
Right, that makes sense.
Or they might just want more control over their schedule in general.
Yeah, I can see that being really appealing as you get older.
And it seems like Canada might be a bit ahead of the curve when it comes to embracing those kinds of flexible work arrangements.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Things like remote work and flexible hours.
Oh, yeah, those are becoming more and more common.
Exactly, and they can be particularly attractive to seniors.
I can see why. Having the option to work from home or set your own hours could make a huge difference in someone's decision to keep working or even go back to work after taking a break.
Absolutely. And I think this ties into a broader cultural difference we've been talking about.
You mean between France and Canada?
Yeah, in Canada, there's a stronger emphasis on individualism and self-reliance.
Like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing.
Exactly, and that attitude extends to the workplace as well.
So how does that translate to more flexible work arrangements?
Well, it might mean that Canadian companies are more open to the idea that employees have different needs and preferences when it comes to work-life balance.
It's less about fitting into a rigid corporate mold and more about finding a setup that works for everyone.
Right, so even if a French company offers remote work, for instance, there might still be an unspoken expectation that you're available during traditional business hours.
So it's not really true flexibility.
Exactly, and that can be tough for someone like Philippe who might need or want more control over their schedule.
So in Canada, he might find more companies that have fully embraced flexible work as part of their DNA.
It's not just a perk, it's a core part of how they operate.
So it's less about asking for special accommodations and more about finding a company whose values already align with your needs.
Exactly, and that can be really empowering for job seekers.
It takes away the pressure of having to explain or justify your need for flexibility.
And allows you to focus on showcasing your skills and experience.
This brings us to a really important question. How do these cultural and policy differences actually play out in the lives of real people?
Yeah, let's move beyond the theory and get into some concrete examples.
Okay, so let's imagine Philippe is looking for a software development job.
Okay, I like that.
How might his experience differ between France and Canada?
Okay, so in France, he might find that a lot of companies still have a pretty traditional work structure.
Meaning what?
Fixed hours, on-site presence.
The old 9 to 5,
Exactly.
even in a field like tech.
It's changing, but maybe not as fast as in some other places.
So while some French companies might offer some flexibility, it might not be as common or as ingrained in the culture as it is in Canada.
Right. And that can create a sort of hidden barrier for older workers who might have different needs.
It's like they have to constantly justify or downplay their desire for flexibility.
Whereas in Canada, Philippe might encounter more companies that have fully embraced remote work and flexible schedules.
It's just the way they do business.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting contrast.
And it could make a big difference in Philippe's job search experience.
So it's not just about the policies in place, but also the underlying attitudes and expectations around work.
Yeah, those unspoken norms can have a huge impact.
All right, so we've talked a lot about the practical side of things,
The policies, the job market, the types of work arrangements.
but there's another layer here that we need to address,
Okay, I'm listening.
and that's the cultural perceptions of aging itself.
Oh, that's an important one.
How do France and Canada view aging?
And how might that affect their approach to senior employment?
That's a great question and one we'll explore right after this short break. Yeah, so we were talking about bien vieillir in France. It's a positive way to look at aging, but the focus is often on leisure and retirement, right?
Yeah, it is. How is that different in Canada, though?
That's what I'm curious about. How do they see it?
Well, they put a lot of emphasis on staying active no matter how old you are. Like, keep doing things, be engaged.
Interesting. So it's not just about relaxing and enjoying retirement.
No, it's more about contributing, being a part of things. It might have something to do with Canada being a relatively young country.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Built on that idea of self-reliance, always pushing forward.
Exactly. And I think that can really affect how they see older workers.
It makes sense. So in France, they respect the wisdom and experience of age. But in Canada, it's about what you can still DO, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think it has a big impact on the job market.
For someone like Salip, looking for a job in his 50s, those different ways of thinking could make a big difference, couldn't they?
Absolutely. Imagine him going to a job interview in France.
Okay, yeah.
He might pick up on these subtle hints that he's almost at retirement age or that he won't be able to keep up with new technology.
It's almost like there's a barrier there, even if nobody says it out loud.
Yeah. And now imagine him at an interview in Canada.
Okay, let's see.
They might be talking about all the experience he has, how he could mentor younger employees, how much he could help the company grow.
Wow, it's like a totally different conversation.
It is. In France, it's about what he's leaving behind, but in Canada, it's about what he brings to the table.
And those little changes can really affect how an older worker feels, right?
Totally. Whether they feel confident or not, whether they feel valued.
It's amazing how much these subtle things can matter.
Yeah.
Well, this deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've seen such interesting differences between France and Canada.
Definitely.
It's clear that there isn't one perfect solution that fits everyone, you know,
Nope. Every country has its own good points and bad points.
and each person's experience is going to be different too.
Exactly.
But I think the main takeaway is that we have to recognize how much older workers contribute.
Yeah. Their experience, what they know, their perspective, it's all so valuable.
To any company, any organization, really.
And with people living longer, it's even more important to make workplaces that include everyone.
And that's something we can all push for, right? No matter where we live, no matter where we are in our careers.
Absolutely.
Well, if you want to keep thinking about these kinds of topics, make sure you subscribe to Le Podcast de Philippe on YouTube.
We've got lots more to explore.
Until next time, keep learning,
G-
keep growing.